He wasn't born into wealth. He didn't grow up in a presidential palace or a military compound. Ibrahim Traoré came into the world in a small village in the Hauts-Bassins region of Burkina Faso, far from the corridors of power, and even farther from the attention of international headlines. But those dusty roads, the sound of roosters at dawn, the low hum of radios echoing local news, they formed the boy who would one day shake the region with his conviction, his youth and his rebellion against the old world order. His early life was marked by silence, not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of listening. As a child, Traoré listened more than he spoke. He listened to his mother humming as she prepared meals over an open fire. He listened to his father arguing about local politics with neighbors under the shade of mango trees. He listened to the radio, shortwave, crackling with the voices of faraway leaders, revolutions and speeches. It wasn't just background noise to him, it was his education. In school, Ibrahim was neither the loudest nor the most disruptive. But he was sharp, unsettlingly so for some teachers. He asked questions that didn't always have simple answers. He wanted to know why Burkina Faso, rich in culture and resilience, always seemed poor in everything else. Why the roads were broken. Why schools were underfunded. Why the best students always talked about leaving. The teachers told him, that's politics. But for him, politics wasn't a subject, it was a wound. Growing up in a post-colonial country meant contradictions were part of everyday life. The French language dominated the classrooms, but Dioula was spoken at home. French history was in the textbooks, but stories of Sankara were told in hushed tones, as if speaking about him too loudly could bring trouble. Traoré heard both. He remembered both. At the age of 12, he had already memorized the speeches of Thomas Sankara, not because someone made him, because it felt like Sankara was the only adult who wasn't lying. The enemies of the people are those who keep them in ignorance, Sankara had said. Ibrahim wrote that down on a piece of cardboard and taped it above his bed. For a kid sleeping on a simple mattress in a hot room with flickering electricity. It felt like truth, a weapon. Traoré wasn't just a dreamer, he was a builder. He organized games in his neighborhood but made sure everyone had a role. If they played soccer, he'd assign defenders, keepers, and strikers like a military strategist. When disagreements came up, he settled them, not with brute force but with logic that left other kids scratching their heads. His father noticed something early on. Ibrahim didn't flinch in front of older men. He didn't bow his head when adults were wrong. He questioned things. That scared some people. Others were intrigued, but no one could ignore him. By the time he was in high school, Traoré's love for science and mathematics stood out. He liked solving problems, real ones, not just equations. He was drawn to physics, not just because of its formulas, but because it explained the unseen forces behind visible events. Later, people would say the same about his leadership, quiet, forceful, unseen until it moved. But school wasn't enough, not when he saw what was happening in the streets. Around the age of 16, Traoré began attending community meetings, sometimes as an observer, sometimes as a participant. His voice was still developing, but his questions were pointed. Why was corruption accepted as normal? Why did young people have to beg for scholarships or opportunities? Why were the same names always on the posters during elections? Some nights after those meetings, he couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from frustration. He began to write in notebooks, not poetry, not diaries, strategies, what he would change, who he would remove, what systems needed to be rebuilt from scratch. At 18, when most of his peers were thinking about getting out of Burkina Faso, Traoré was thinking about staying and fixing it. But he knew he needed power. Not power for its own sake, power to make change real. So he joined the military. It wasn't a glamorous decision. There were no promises of riches, no easy path to glory. But in the military, he saw structure, discipline, strategy, and more importantly, he saw access. The kind of access that could open doors to real influence. At the military academy, Traoré stood out for different reasons. He didn't drink excessively, didn't get into pointless fights, didn't chase popularity. He was calm, focused. He read political theory while others relaxed. He studied warfare, not just tactics, but most of all, he watched people. He studied leadership in silence, waiting for his moment. But his past wasn't behind him, it was shaping him. He remembered the villages with no roads, the teachers who went unpaid, the kids who had to drop out to farm. He knew the statistics. But more than that, he felt the injustice. So he rose, not because he was loud, but because he was ready. There were moments in the army when he could have played it safe. Salute, follow orders, climb ranks quietly, but that wasn't his path. Traoré wasn't content with being a cog in a broken system. He believed reform had to come from within, but not through compromise, through conviction. He began forging relationships, not the superficial kind, but real bonds. He listened to fellow soldiers, especially the younger recruits. They confided in him. They talked about their families, their struggles, how they were sent into regions abandoned by the state, left without resources, sometimes even without food. Traoré didn't lecture them. He nodded, made notes, asked questions. The soldiers noticed something. He didn't speak like a superior officer. He spoke like someone who understood, someone who had been there, and the officers, some admired him, others feared him, because he had something rare, loyalty from below, not just recognition from above. But that loyalty didn't come from charisma alone, it came from courage. When he was deployed in the Sahel, the reality of Burkina Faso's crisis hit him in the face. The jihadist threat wasn't some distant problem, he saw its impact firsthand. Entire villages displaced, schools shut down, civilians caught between armed groups and an ineffective government. He saw commanders give up on territories before even trying to defend them. He saw politicians more interested in appearing on TV than solving anything, and then something inside him shifted. That's when Ibrahim Traoré stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a leader of a different kind. In the barracks, he would gather the troops and speak plainly. "No one is coming to save us," he told them. "Not France, not ECOWAS, not the UN. If we don't take our country back, no one will." Some rolled their eyes, others felt the fire light inside them. He didn't just speak, he acted. He coordinated supply drops more efficiently. He pressured superiors to send reinforcements. And when no one listened, he organized local patrols anyway, not to disobey, but to protect people who had been abandoned. And then it happened. In early 2022, the murmurs of discontent grew louder. President Damiba had come to power promising change, promising security, promising reform. But nothing was changing. The attacks continued. The corruption worsened. And Traore, like many others, realized that the system wasn't broken by accident. It was designed to fail the people and serve the few. On October 2nd, 2022, the coup was launched. But this time, it wasn't led by the usual suspects in decorated uniforms with foreign ties. It was led by a 34-year-old captain with sharp eyes and a quiet voice. The world was stunned. Burkina youth celebrated, not because they love coups, but because they saw someone like them in charge for once. Someone who knew what hardship looked like. Someone who hadn't studied abroad while the country burned. Someone who didn't speak in vague diplomatic language, but in the raw vocabulary of truth. And Traore, he didn't throw a lavish inauguration. He didn't order golden chairs or demand statues. Instead, he got to work. He spoke directly to the people in Dioula in French in the language of urgency. He announced a break with the past. He condemned neocolonialism, corruption, and betrayal. But being in power was different. The problems were deeper than even he had imagined. He found institutions hollowed out from within. Foreign powers deeply embedded in the economy, in intelligence, in politics. Contracts signed in secret. Mines exploited by foreign companies while local communities remained impoverished. And worse, military aid that came with strings, not solutions. He had to make choices fast. He cut ties with France's military presence. A bold move, some called it reckless. But to Traore, sovereignty wasn't negotiable. "How can we fight terrorism?" he asked, "if the ones arming the terrorists also claim to be our allies?" Pivoted to Russia not out of ideology but out of necessity, to diversify, to break dependency. He strengthened ties with Mali and Niger, forming the Alliance of Sahel states, a coalition not just of geography but of purpose. African-led, African prioritized security, and the risks, immense. Sanctions, threats, isolation. But Traore knew something that his predecessors ignored. The people were watching, and for the first time in years they were hopeful. At rallies, children wore shirts with his face, not because he demanded it, but because they saw their brother, their cousin, their friend from the village now standing tall. But he never forgot where he came from. In private meetings, he reminded his cabinet, "We must build schools before we build statues. We must feed people before we feed egos." He returned to his village once, not with cameras, not for PR, just to sit with the elders, to listen. He visited his old school. He hugged his former teachers. One of them asked him half jokingly, "So, Ibrahim, now that you're president, will you remember us?" He smiled and said, "I am you." That humility isn't performative. It's rooted in the soil he walked on barefoot as a child, in the meals he shared under tin roofs, in the dreams he wrote in notebooks by candlelight. But Ibrahim Traoré's story isn't a fairy tale. He faces real dangers, from internal dissent, from entrenched elites, from international backlash. His youth is both his strength and his risk. He learns as he leads. He makes mistakes and he owns them. But what sets him apart is this: he listens. He listens to farmers, to students, to market women, to soldiers. He listens to the pulse of a nation that has bled too long. And the boy who once taped a quote from Sankara above his bed now has his own words echoing across Africa. "We will not be the generation that kneels. We will be the generation that stands." His childhood didn't prepare him for comfort. It prepared him for struggle. And struggle, it seems, is exactly where he finds his purpose. But power changes people, or reveals them. As the months rolled on, Traore found himself in unfamiliar territory. Not the dusty roads of his village or the tense patrols of the Sahel, but long, air-conditioned meetings, full of bureaucracy, pressure, and manipulation. Now everyone wanted something from him. Old political figures resurfaced, some seeking favor, others looking to sabotage. Foreign diplomats made offers wrapped in smiles but tied to control. And still, he held the line. He imposed reforms that irritated the elite, cut salaries of certain high-ranking officials, audited government contracts, investigated long-standing deals with multinational companies that had drained Burkina Faso's gold, manganese, and other resources for decades. That's when the real test began. Not a coup, not an invasion, but But the slow, grinding war of attrition, the kind that topples most reformers, rumors began circulating. Traore was too young, too radical, too untested. Whispers suggested he was turning authoritarian. Others claimed he had ties to mercenaries. The international media painted him with the usual brush: populist, anti-Western, pro-Russian. But inside Burkina Faso, a different story was unfolding. Young people began volunteering, not just for the military, but for civic patrols, education programs, farming collectives. There was a sense, for the first time in years, that their actions mattered, that their sacrifices counted, and it all traced back to the boy from Hauts-Bassins who had once asked, "Why must our children leave to dream?" In the countryside, old men debated whether Traore was the return of Sankara's spirit. That was a heavy name to wear. Sankara had been betrayed by his own comrades, assassinated in a coup orchestrated by those closest to him. Traore knew that history better than anyone, and he wasn't naive. He set up personal protection not through luxury but through trust, surrounding himself with soldiers he had trained alongside. Brothers in arms who had seen him bleed, not just give orders. His government remained tight, lean, unpolished. Critics called it amateur, supporters called it clean, but the burdens were real. In late 2023, when terrorist attacks intensified in the north, Traore made a rare emotional address. He didn't hide behind slogans. He admitted they had underestimated the enemy's reach. "But we will not abandon our people," he said. "If it means I have to wear a uniform and return to the field, I will." And people believed him, because he already had. Multiple times, Traore had quietly left the capital to visit the front lines, not for photo ops, but to assess morale, to listen, to grieve with soldiers who had buried comrades. He carried no press entourage, only a notebook and a weapon. One soldier later said, "He didn't talk to us like a president, he talked to us like a captain who remembered what it meant to be hungry and surrounded." Still, not everyone was impressed. The international community, especially former colonial powers, tightened the pressure. Aid was reduced, sanctions were threatened, meetings were canceled. Burkina Faso was labeled unstable. But Traore doubled down. He said, "If aid comes with humiliation, it is not help, it is control." Instead of begging for loans, he turned to internal development. Agriculture programs, local manufacturing, free military training for youths. He cut unnecessary imports and encouraged Burkinabe innovation. One by one, symbolic steps became practical ones. He had never forgotten that his mother once walked 5 kilometers to fetch clean water, so he signed off on well-building initiatives across rural zones, quietly. No red ribbons, just function. He remembered how his father once lost a harvest because of drought and no irrigation, so he pushed funding into solar-powered water systems for farming communities. This wasn't ideology, it was memory. And then there were the children. Traore was deeply committed to rebuilding the education system, not just physically, but morally. He ordered that Thomas Sankara's speeches be studied, not worshipped, that African philosophy be taught alongside world history, that children learn how their ancestors resisted colonization, not just how they were colonized. But he also knew the limits. Many villages still lacked basic infrastructure. So he launched the One School, One Generator program, solar panels, radios, community libraries, and in many places the schools began to double as gathering centers, places where adults could also learn at night. Was it perfect? No. But for a generation that had grown up under cynicism, this new mood was a quiet revolution. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, and Traore was still young. In private, his closest advisors say he often stays up reading intelligence briefs himself. He rarely delegates blindly. He checks reports, sometimes argues with generals. He demands honesty, and when someone lies, he removes them without ceremony. He's made enemies, inside and outside. But he's made something rarer: belief, not belief in him. Belief that change, actual change, is possible in Burkina Faso. By early 2025, Traore had outlasted expectations. Many thought he'd be ousted within 6 months. Instead, he consolidated regional alliances, refused to be dragged into petty diplomatic wars, even gained cautious admiration from unlikely places. And yet he doesn't claim victory. He once said in a closed meeting, "The real war is not with bullets, it's with despair. If we let our people believe nothing can change, then we've already lost." That's the voice of a child who once saw his neighbors pack their bags for Côte d'Ivoire, never to return. The voice of a student who stayed behind when others fled the country for scholarships. The voice of a captain who remembered the names of every soldier he lost. And the voice of a leader who, when asked if he'd ever consider staying in power long-term, simply said, "I will stay as long as I serve the people. The moment I serve myself, I will step down or be removed." A promise, a warning, a legacy in motion.